Director of the Design Museum London and has previously held the position of Artistic Director of the Royal Academy of Arts, in addition to Director of Exhibitions at White Keep. In 2020, Tim was appointed Officer of the Order of the British Empire for his service to the arts, following an extensive career leading some of the world's largest arts and culture institutions, writing numerous books, catalogues and monographs, and broadcasting over 100 documentaries and lecturing in more than 40 countries. So please join me again in welcoming Tim Marlow.
Can I say thank you all for coming at a very busy time in the Oxford calendar. I know there's exams, and I know actually in the summer term, on a night like this, there are probably better things to do, so it's good to see some of you here.
Thank you very much for being with us today. I'd like to start off by asking you, why is it important to have an institution dedicated to design? What, in your opinion, makes the Design Museum different from other arts institutions?
It's a very good question. I mean, first is that there isn't one. So we need a design museum. Design should be much more embedded into fabric and cultural fabric of different institutions. The V&A is a wonderful museum. It's set up with what was called the applied arts, the decorative arts. It does deal with design, but it deals with design in the past, up to the present. The Design Museum was set up actually by Terence Conrad as a subsidiary of the V&A, and it was literally given space down in the old boiler house in the basement, and in the end it grew out of its purpose and expanded and then went east. And the Design Museum is really to look at design, present and future. And it is just so evident to me that design should be more explored. It's so broad, design. What's interesting to me is that perhaps the greatest museum of modern art in the world, MoMA, New York, which was founded in 1929, I'm sure you all know, design was embedded from the start. So in that museum and in the vision that was put forward of modernism, design, architecture and art sat in the same institution in different departments, but they coexisted. And whereas our own wonderful Museum of Modern Art, Tate Modern, which was only founded, it became a reality through the 90s, opened in 2000. The Tate didn't show photography, it didn't acknowledge photography as an art form until late 1990s, when artistic practice was such that it just forced the Tate to start looking at photography embedded into art. So we've always been more siloed in this country, and in a sense, it's not that my mission my hope would be, I've been running for 20 years, but in 20 years' time, design's so embedded that there's less need for a design museum. But actually, I think there probably always will be, because it's got to represent disparate communities of designers. One of the things I've loved in my career is working with artists. The Royal Academy, but it's always been run by artists and architects. They rotate on council. And having a place that is for them, run by them, we can talk about the Academy another time. There's a staff. When I was artistic director, they couldn't tell me what to do, but I had to take them on that journey. And I think that one of the things I'd like to do is get closer to design and designers, because it's such a brilliantly fertile territory, both globally but also Britain is good at it. And so there's all those reasons for sort of making it a hub. But we're quite a long way back actually in terms of the kind of country.
You just discussed, about designers, and could you tell us a couple of your favourite designers?
Well, yeah, but what interests me is that, so I'm going to answer the question, but I'm going to approach it from a completely way. When I was doing exhibition programming at the Royal Academy, in the 6 years I was there, we did everything from the Renaissance nude with the Getty to a major survey of Oceania, the art and culture of Oceania, to an Anthony Gormley show that literally flooded one of the galleries, to an Ai Weiwei show who's coming to talk to you soon. And the audiences that came to the Royal Academy and the friends have very strong opinions about certain shows and certain artists, and they let you know what they think. But they come and look at what you put on. And the trust is because they believe in something called art, which we would describe as with a capital A. So the taste varies, but they know what art is. Now, I'm not sure with design whether the people who are interested in graphic design are necessarily interested in architecture, are necessarily interested in fashion, are necessarily interested in product design or industrial design or AI or all the other facets of design. But I'm trying to see if there's a call for that. And also, one of the great things about design is there are tribes or groups of people that will come and see different things, which means that museums get this obsession with trying to expand audiences, and they want younger audiences. Our audiences are over 50% are under the age of 35, and I can virtually tap into a new audience, or significant new audiences, for almost every show we do. If it's various, as sneakers, or football, or ASMR at the moment, or Charlotte Perriman, or Amy Winehouse. So you've got this amazing potential. So my own favourite designers shouldn't count for that much, because the remit should be to look at broad and wide. But I would love to be, I'm getting increasingly interested in architecture as something that is never really confronted well by museums. I mean, we did a Lorenzo piano show at the Royal Academy, and Lorenzo was brilliant because we just had 12 big tables with ideas for projects on each one that was kind of coherent like a laboratory. And that was the closest I've ever seen to an exhibition sort of conveying the essence of architecture. Because architecture, you want to be in it rather than just showing a photograph or models. So I'd love to do a Carlo Scarpa show, a great Venetian modernist. I'd love to work more extensively with look back at British modernism and brutalism of the kind that you have a lot of in this college. Philip Dowse, underrated, amazing builder. But I also have a particular penchant for kind of crossover. So Ai Weiwei, although he's one of my he's one of my favourite artists in the world, someone I've worked with, someone I consider a friend. But I think he's a great architect, and I think he's a great blurrer of distinction. And for him, design and art and curation and activism overlap. So I would claim him, as long as I'm at the Design Museum, as potentially one of us, and then when I leave the Design Museum, he can get back to being an artist. But I love that kind of blurring and that kind of crossover. I really admire people like, there's some emerging fashion designers. There's a particular young designer called Samuel Ross, who's a protege of Virgil Abloh, among others. A Cold Wall is Samuel's brand at the moment. He's looking at furniture design and art, but fashion design. I think he's incredibly talented. Grace Wells-Bond, I think, is really talented artist, fashion designer. I think they're, I can't really get wearing their clothes. We've got a brilliant display at the moment at the museum, where, I don't know if you know about the design, the emergency design network, but some young designers actually, as soon as the lockdown happened, started using all their seamstresses and people who work for them to make scrubs for the NHS, and I thought that sense of kind of activism was really brilliantly inspiring. I think people like Stella McCartney are kind of underrated globally. The list goes on. Sorry, that was a very long one down. It's a very simple question. I could have just said Carlo Scarpa and Sam Ross.
We're touching on so many interesting areas here. It's really hard to jump in at everything you say. But one of the other things you're talking about was audiences. So I'm kind of interested in how audiences at different ages receive artworks and design and even architecture. So how would you say, in your opinion, perceptions of design differ between adults and children? And how does the Design Museum and museum environments more generally aim to cater towards these differences in the exhibitions, the displays? You were also talking about architecture. What do you think?
I think trying to make exhibitions, I said earlier I wanted to get closer to designers in the same way that I've enjoyed working with living artists. I think working with creative people, I don't romanticize them, but I think the idea of trying to work with people when they're alive gives you the opportunity both to try and help make history, but also to do that which cannot be done once they're dead. And too many of my curatorial colleagues, less so now, but have tended to treat living artists as if they're dead entities, where you curate a retrospective of a living artist. Of course, some artists want to be curated, and some artists want to step away and let someone else try and make sense of their career today. That's fine. But my interest is in collaboration, trying to make things with people, harnessing them as living entities. And it would be the same with design in that way. But trying to make shows that appeal only to fellow designers or artists is a mistake for museums. Our remit is to try and make visible the impact of design. So the remit is to reach broad audiences. So one of the things that I find really interesting is a kind of approach that ought to appeal to a range of audiences, that actually family audiences, or, I mean, so sneakers was a great case in point, because clearly audiences under 50 are more interested. But it is interesting, if you put a good show on and there's momentum, the cultural curiosity of people across generations is there, self-evident. And I think that one of the things that design allows is a lens through which we can scrutinise or observe quite disparate things. So I'm not being shamelessly populist in doing a design and football show that's on at the moment. I mean, I happen to be very interested in football, but I've seen so many crap art and football shows in my life. It's just like a random lecture of 15 different artworks that happen in some ways to engage with football, but it doesn't mean anything. Whereas if you say, well look, football's 150 years old, I think the way we understand it now, the modern game, and if you look at through design, which has never been done before in a coherent and systematic way, you can look at, I mean, we've done it in 5 sections, so you look at performance to begin with. So the whole evolution of football is through the design, mainly of balls and boots. Then there's medical science and there's design or redesign of the body. Then you go to identity, the whole idea about shirt design, badges and so on, which again is initially they used to wear caps, then there were shirts. Now it's become a kind of global branding, but major design area. Then we look at spectacle, so the idea of crowds actually, first, so the subcultures of crowds. Then spectacle, then stadiums, the whole architectural design of stadiums. And then we look at mediation, so the whole idea of global tournaments and the way that it's being mass marketed as a global phenomenon, but that again, through design, media, and then play. And once you realise that those are the sections, you think, yeah, no one's looked at football in this way. And Gary Lineker came here to talk together and take me around the show a few weeks ago. There were many things in that show that we hadn't thought of or didn't see. So design allows us to look at familiar things in a slightly different way, and also to make it evident to people just how much design is responsible for everything, from this to that, to the phones you've got, to the clothes you're wearing. I mean, and also for the responsibilities of design for problems. I mean, we did a big wastage show. We fronted up that design and mass consumption and consumerism was responsible for many of the problems, but that design would probably be the best way through the fact that in 50 years' time, waste material will be the biggest single resource on the planet. So what are design and material scientists doing to find solutions and ways through that, which is kind of inspiring. So, but it was a question about audiences, and I again gone off on that. But I think that if you approach it through subject matter and the different ways in which you can use design. So we did an Amy Winehouse show through the lens of design. We're going to do an Irish show, keep it to yourselves, looking at design and architecture. We're going to do a big fashion survey next year. But there's a whole range of things that can be surveyed through the lens of design that by definition could and should appeal to a whole range of different audiences. But you target audiences through the programming of learning or talks or events or parties or workshops. So we do family workshops, and there's a lot of hands-on workshops that go on at weekends. We have a big schools program. One of the things I love most about the learning program, the Design Museum, more than learning programs in arts institutions that I've been involved in, that have been wonderful, is that we do this thing called Design Ventura. It's not mine, it's 12 years old this year. And it's targeted to state schools because there's a resource issue there, and we put a big resource into it. So this year, a tenth of all state schools in the country responded to this and got involved. And the Design Ventura is that school children between the age of 14 and 16, in groups of no more than 5, need to design a product that can be made and sold in the Design Museum shop. It used to be under £10, it's now under £15. And that they come to the museum, they're given, there's budget for to schools from around the country, they're given mentoring advice, they're given product design, they're given budgeting and so on. And then the 10 shortlisted designs are shown at the museum, they're on now. And the winning entry, which a series of designers and businessmen people will select the winner, the winning design is made and sold in the shop. And last year's winner, which is now in the shop, I should have brought you a load for your gardens, because it's actually it's a seed cannon where it's filled with different kinds of seeds, and there's a mechanism in it, and it fires seeds. Well, it's a beautiful thing. So it's £9.99, and you can create your own measure. And this is designed by a school in Leeds, 14, 15-year-olds.
Wow.
The whole thing. It's great.
I mean,
Okay, I didn't answer your question again, did I?
I mean, you just discussed, you know, at depth kind of previous exhibitions and exhibitions that you have, you know, in the works, and you're struck by the kind of flexibility and the variety of fashion, football, shoes. How would you say that kind of coming up with exhibitions and flexibility, and is it very different to your previous like career, you know, working in the academy and like youth and stuff like that?
Yeah, it is.
And does it have any like challenges or different challenges within that?
It has lots of challenges. One is that I don't want to sound like a poacher turned gamekeeper. I mean, I revere art. It's what motivates me. There's not a day that goes by that I don't look at it or think about it or live with it. But it's a strange convention in the West that art with absolutely no function, and that's part of that, it's philosophically wrestling with who we are and asking big questions, and it offers many things. I'm not saying it's without purpose, but its function doesn't exist in a practical sense. And design is always to a particular end of function. And for that reason, paradoxically, design is much less valued. And I find that, I mean, in some ways, it's kind of heartening, because it means as a society, we value things that take us out of the mundaneness of our need to exist and survive. But it's such a contradiction culturally to me that art is often ridiculed or misunderstood, or it's not politically revered in any kind of way. If you look at the way that we're supported across the cultural sector, notwithstanding the fact that the government actually did surprise everyone, I salute their cultural recovery fund, and it was really impressive. But broadly speaking, our political life has no real value for culture. And so you would think, therefore, that I would be pushing at an open door, running a design museum, with massive state support. Our support is a sixth of the Serpentine Gallery, a fifth of the Photographer's Gallery. It's a minuscule amount compared with other institutions. I don't want to keep naming because it sounds like I'm moaning the fact that they get funding. But we get a tiny amount of funding. And that is a real challenge, because although we've been properly backed in the past by Terence Conran, and I do believe in a kind of hybrid model for funding. There's all sorts of initiatives that we're able to come up with. We can be very entrepreneurial in design and design museum, and we are. But I find it extraordinary that there's no state backing, and that was one of the provocations or challenges. One of the reasons I wanted to go to design museum, because well, this is a case that has to be made. It's crazy, you know. There's masses of art institutions in London, and I love them all. And the private art world that I have spent some time in, White Cube, some of the mega galleries are doing extraordinary exhibitions. You know, so incrementally, in the last 20 years, London has seen an explosion of commercial art galleries who are doing extraordinary projects. And there's one design museum, and you know, we need to make the case. So I'm still bemused, but partly lockdown. And I joined in January 2020, and I'm probably the worst director that museum's ever had, because within 3 months I had to close it down. And then we came back, and then we closed, then we came back. And at the moment we're looking at audiences across the cultural sector. They're nowhere near that which they were before the pandemic, although we're doing well with football and ASMR.
I mean, you briefly touched on like funding. Are your exhibitions perhaps dictated by sponsorship, and who will fund your exhibition?
Yeah, sponsorship is an issue actually. We don't get enough, and I have to say that in all institutions I worked in the Royal Academy in particular, sponsors were absolutely brilliant. In other words, you explain what the shows are, and you ask them if they'd be interested in sponsoring it. And there are some sponsors. There's one French bank, BNP Paribas, who would sign up for 3 major shows over 3 years or 5 years, and they vaguely know what the shows were, but they would support you in the program. I mean, there'd be 3 major artists. So the myth, but I know it's happened in other sectors, but the myth that the sponsor starts to dictate what the programme is, certainly I've never seen that in institutions. So I kind of salute sponsorship, but it's more difficult over the last 2 or 3 years. Corporate sponsorship is a problem. But the model that institutions have to do blockbusters increasingly to drive audiences to survive there's a truth in it. I mean, it's there. But that's another reason why we as institutions need to find more sustainable ways of funding our institutions. And actually try to produce institutions where it doesn't matter if the place isn't heaving. It doesn't matter if you aren't putting shows on that millions of people or hundreds of thousands of people want to come to all the time. You want to kind of... I find it really odd that some of the big state institutions talk about slow looking, and they have the great national collections, and yet they're scrabbling to do more and more blockbuster exhibitions, and we get to kind of hamster wheel if we're not careful. I mean, we've just actually managed to get some funding, substantial funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council. It doesn't help me run the museum. It doesn't mean to say we're not going to be in serious squeeze in the next 2 or 3 years, but it's a generous funding for a project called Future Observatory, where for the next 4 years, the Design Museum will become a hub, a kind of laboratory, but the centre of a network of 15 design research departments in universities around the country. And we will be the place where that research becomes mediated, sometimes shown. We've got 4 design researchers in residence. We'll do displays, we'll convene symposia, we'll advocate to policymakers, we'll speak to politicians, we'll bring business and design together, which is really interesting because design tends not to exist in a kind of bedroom and then is discovered later. But design research will explain, or also will define the parameters of a particular area. But we need to get that design research connected with entrepreneurs and business in order for it to happen. But also at a time of economic downturn, what happens in major corporations or smaller businesses is that this research and development goes out the window. So there's a massive role that we can play there. And that, I really love that idea, because that's not about driving masses of people to the museum. It's a museum as a laboratory, as a showcase, as a place which you start to try and make a difference. Likewise shown in Design Ventura, where we get thousands of people to come and see it. But maybe there's a pathway for designers of the future, which kind of matters. So I think that museums in general, and art, the Design Museum in particular, we need to look across the spectrum of what it is we do. And you can make a difference as a museum in so many different ways. It isn't just about getting people en masse to come to the museum. But one of the things that lockdown has shown, and one of the things I sort of believe passionately, is that the digital era, the digital revolution, which obviously much of which is designed, is phenomenal, exciting, but actually it's just part of the cultural landscape. It's never going to replace the museum. And one of the things that museums have sort of realised, if they lost sight of it before, is that people's desire for communal or physical experiences collectively in physical spaces is undiminished. I mean, in fact, people want it more. And that's enough. But it doesn't mean so you have to sort of have a mass celebration with 10,000 people rammed into a design football show. But it does mean that you want to come to these places and get the opportunity to look and think and be surprised and engaged and so on.
So there are many different players that are going into putting on an exhibition, whether that's sponsors or galleries, and artists are a key one of that. And so what do you think are important considerations when thinking about the relationship between an artist and gallery when you're putting on an exhibition? And what factors influence these decisions of an artist and a gallery working together on displays and exhibitions? Is having the same perspective on technology, for example, the digital and how they communicate meaning in their work, for example, is that important? Is taste important?
Yeah. So when you say galleries, you mean commercial galleries?
Any kind of gallery.
See, it's interesting because all major artists work to a varying degree, but mostly very closely with commercial galleries. And the commercial gallery is the kind of, it's not just the agent, it's often the broker of projects, but it provides space and budget for artists to do things. And often, the major galleries will be supporting explicitly and sometimes discreetly major projects for their artists in institutions. And actually, make no bones about the fact that, Anthony Gorman's big show at the Royal Academy or Ai Weiwei's show at the Royal Academy were generously supported by galleries. Interestingly enough, major designers who are seen as flagrantly more commercial often don't have the backing of the equivalent galleries and their own budgets to put into exhibitions. They don't have it, it goes into product. So actually, the commercial art is a very interesting and useful support mechanism for artists. Most artists want the context of public space and engagement. And so how you do that should be, I think, collaborative. And they do, to varying degrees, want the work mediated. But I find that, again, interesting, that there's some institutions have set ways of doing things. I mean, when Anthony Gorman made that show at the Royal Academy in 2019, he didn't want any labelling, and I said, that's interesting and I understand why you don't. And discrete labelling and giving people the opportunity of having something completely unmediated is great. But we are going to have labelling, but we're going to do it just as you come into the space, and the space is uncontaminated by it, because people need to know where they need, the journey needs to be articulated. And we'll do leaflets so they can take on the journey there, but so the compromise was kind of agreed. And then he wanted nobody to have the opportunity to circumvent the big body form, so they had to go through the darkness. And I said, well, apart from health and safety and people bashing their heads and stuff, we can't discriminate against claustrophobics or people who just don't want to go into the space. And also, if we want the one-on-one meditation, that's brilliant. Let's do it in the upstairs gallery, and people will do 10 people an hour, and people can book it, and we won't bother with the big show. Because if we're going to do a big show through the big galleries at the Royal Academy, if you don't beat Anish Kapoor's number of audience figures, what's the point? I said as a joke, but I did say the point is that you're taking on those spaces for a lot of people to come through. Anthony's very good-natured, he's also idealistic, he's also ambitious, so all those things kind of bring. So it's a compromise, but in the end, the most important thing was that the institution was able literally to engineer and work alongside him, his team, and our own engineers and structural engineers to produce one of the most ambitious shows that institution's ever done. But, he's pushing, we're pushing, and in the end, we get to a position, so there's compromise. But when you see it, it looks like a phenomenally uncompromising exhibition. Did it matter? Did he feel in the end that it had been over-compromised by small labels? No. But, that's the kind of give and take. But would it have been ruined as an experience if we'd insisted that we must have mega text everywhere? Because a lot of our friends at the Royal Academy, the Friends organisation, always complain about labels. They're never big enough. So if I'd adhered to some of the friends, I would literally have had billboards so that they could read what's going on. Would that have wrecked the exhibition? Absolutely. So there's the compromise. And when he flooded the final gallery, we wanted to have two ways of looking at it. And he said, no, I don't want that, because people will then see other people looking at it, and I want them just to contemplate the space. So we said, well, if it's at the end, the problem is it might be a bottleneck. But in the end, we just agreed that we'd have to do it that way, and we did it that way. So then there was a step up to it, and he wanted people to be able to stand on the step and look over the water, which reflected the ceiling and so on. And again, I said, look, this is a great thing, but when Ai Weiwei did his sacred piece in the Royal Academy, which are the 7, there were boxes, but you look down into them and there were vignettes from his time in prison. It was called Sacred, S-A-C-R-E-D. And we were fishing probably 7 or 8 mobile phones a day out of that piece. People just putting it in the photos and dropping it into it. If I'm not with something that damage the art, it is kind of amazing that people don't think. So I said the problem with letting people get that close onto me is that we will, I don't care if people lose their phones, but it will wreck the surface of the piece, and we will have to get those phones out every day. And it will, because this was seawater and mud, so the piece will constantly be in a state of churn. So that's why we need a guard and a barrier. Can we agree on that? Okay. So he did. And so in the end, we didn't have a barrier, the step was there, there was a guard standing there. And just being like, just so you photograph from there, we lost no mobile phones. But on a patron's night, I sort of did an introduction, and then our patrons were able to wander out. And the next day, my head of exhibitions, she's brilliant, she came to my office and she said, we need to do a botulism analysis of the water piece. I said, what? She said, are you joking? She said, no. She said, one of the patrons, we didn't have guards there, one of the patrons knelt down, put her fingers in the water and did that. And someone said, she said, well, it's seawater. And so, anyway, off she went. And they said, we didn't recognise who she was, but I mean, that water, by the time we had opened, that was seawater that had been stagnant for 3 weeks. There was mud from the field in Hertfordshire. I mean, why would you do that? Anyway, so she tested, we got the test back, and she said, well, I wouldn't want to be drinking it. And we didn't hear back from this person, so they either died discreetly or nothing. But you never, I mean, museums need to trust their audiences, and they need to give artists and designers the best opportunity, but they also need to be aware that people do strange things in institutions. When we did a Kiefer show, there was a big tower of these concrete breeze blocks in the courtyard, stacked one on top of the other. And he has these amazing lead books that have all sorts of symbolism, but also structurally, they're craned on top of each other, these breeze block corners. So you get these fantastic towers, and they sink into the lead and it holds them. And so we had all this structural engineering, fantastic, the courtyard could take it, and it certainly wouldn't topple. So we didn't need security guards in the structure, people could just go into it. But then someone said, look, we have to just think there's lead. If you're not going to have people guarding, it's quite expensive to have guards, if you don't need them, it's good. What about lead poisoning? So we had to do a survey, we had to get a survey, and I got this brilliant thing back, and it said, you would have to lick the lead continuously for 6 hours to get lead poisoning. So I wanted to put a sign up, and I was told that this was churlish, and I was to do it, saying, please do not lick the lead for more than 5.5 hours. But anyway, people behave pretty well in that. And I kind of pride myself on not patronising audiences or expecting well of them, but you have to protect your institution from what people might do because you're liable. That didn't answer the question, did it? But about compromise and working together, and so I also think that you have to give your audiences the information they want. And the idea that you just project people into a show and expect them to understand it is delusional. And it's not providing audiences what they want. But if you're working collaboratively with creative individuals, with artists and designers, they have to come on the journey with you. But if you're doing your own surveys, like football, definitely we're very clear about, right, section 1, identity, and there's good information as to where that is. But also the whole, where the digital can help, where podcasts, where the whole learning program can really help, is that you use exhibitions as a springboard to explore it in different ways and take people on those kind of journeys. So exhibitions need to work on so many different levels. With art, things actually need to work in so many different ways, viscerally and emotionally and intellectually. And you need to give people the option of experiencing it in different ways rather than assaulting people with information. I don't believe our art exhibitions are meant to be dispensed for people's well-being. They're thrust down their throats, but I do believe if people want to know about something, it should be an easy thing to do in an exhibition. You shouldn't have to say, well, what is that? There ought to be a way of being able to identify. So labelling around this college.
Well, I was going to say that you've raised some really interesting points about text and image and art, whether it be a warning sign or whether it be even the titles of exhibitions. That's very interesting, particularly with these big names that you've been mentioning. How important is that when you're thinking about audience and public, enticing viewers through the name of an exhibition? Is that important? Should it matter? Yeah. When you have a big name, is that going to determine how successful the exhibition is? A lot of the design museums exhibitions, football trainers, we're not talking about identity of a person here in the same way. So how does that affect your audience, your publicity, the reception of the exhibition?
It really does, and actually something I learned late. I mean, I think the name of an artist is often enough. And when you work with single artists, I think just either way, Anthony Gormley, that's what we've done. I mean, I think there were suggestions of titles from some of those exhibitions, but in the main we've just got the names because the big gallery shows at the Royal Academy, which living artists haven't had those until recently, and the programme is a new initiative. But the artist name is enough, I think, and it's clear. But marketing departments in the museums are really important, but the idea that you can focus group an exhibition title has always been something I've resisted. But I have to confess that when we did the big Oceania survey show at the Academy, the show was just called Oceania. And there's no doubt that that title wasn't enough for a lot of audiences. So I think we probably, the marketing department of the Royal Academy definitely thinks so, we missed out on quite a lot of audience because they didn't know what it was. Now, they wanted a subtitle, you know, so the Art of the South Seas, or the Art of, there was a whole range of titles. The problem was that exhibition, which was kind of exceptional, had been a 10-year research project by two brilliant scholars, one of Nick Thomas, who's the director of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at Cambridge, who's an Australian, and Peter Brandt, who's a New Zealander of Samoan and Maori descent, based in Christchurch. And they got a research grant from the European Council to research the oceanic art and artefacts in European collections for 10 years. And that became the basis of an exhibition that was, I insisted it had to, I mean, I wanted to program it, but I wanted it in 2018 because it was the Royal Academy's 250th anniversary, and it was exactly at that time that as the Academy was being founded that Cook went to the South Seas. So it was a perfect thing, but also a lot of it was artefacts and objects that hadn't really been seen, rather than, you know, post-colonial maybe or New Zealand. The New Zealand government were brilliantly generous in supporting that, and these two scholars had spent all the time negotiating and talking to various, I mean, not just nations, but tribal groupings of people, and it was an exemplary way. All artefacts were kind of agreed, provenance was agreed, and so on. But Oceania was the only term that everyone from that region felt was appropriate and didn't offend or was not accurate. So we were caught in this thing where there wasn't really a subtitle that we could add because it wouldn't have been accurate. So we were, in the end, had to stick with that. And I thought that was fine. And I don't know what the solution was. Once the show had finished, that was it. But I know now if I did it again, I would have to try and find a way of just explaining a little more of what it was. So when we did abstract expressionism, and I said, I mean, that's got to be the title, abstract expressionism. And then the marketing department was saying, so can't we say, you know, painters at the New York School? Well, we could, except that Clifford Still wasn't from New York, and nor was San Francis. And then there was a whole load of rebels and stuff. I said, look, it's not Tony Hancock. Abstract expressionism is the title. It ought to do it. But in the end, they said, well, could we think about strapline of artists? And I said, no, that's great. So then the graphic design thing is abstract expressionism, but then there's a kind of ticker tape down the side of the bottom, and you're thinking, no, that's great. I mean, of course I'm all for that. A lot of exhibitions end up with subtitles. They end up like bad academic paintings from the 1980s, you know, post-war Paris, art and existentialism in Paris from 1945 to 1950. Thinking that's not an exhibition title, it's just a paper I'm never going to read. But, which was a Tate exhibition title, by the way, at one stage. But so you have to also find something snappy, but you also need, so I'm increasingly for subtitles if it explains what the show is about. So you definitely, titles matter. And it's how people engage. But titles don't always need to be literal. So we've got a show on at the moment called Weird Sensation Feels Good. Don't you think of that? And the show is ASMR. I don't know if you know what it is. I didn't for a year ago, or I vaguely knew what it was. My then 11-year-old son did. And ASMR stands for Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response. Now, when the curator of this exhibition, who's from a British curator who works for an organisation in Sweden, they did the show first, and we've taken it in partnership with them. He was asked by a journalist at a conference recently, what does ASMR mean? He said, autonomous sensory meridian response. Then there was a pause and he went, no, me neither. And I thought that was brilliantly honest. This is a term that was invented in 2009. The phenomenon of ASMR is a big internet phenomenon. You know, it's sensation, prickling, you know, hairs on the back of your neck, the sounds of crinkles. People share, it's meditative, it's kind of well-being, it's immersive. People literally watch paint dry, and it becomes this phenomenon. And in the installation we've done at the Design Museum, I'm absolutely captivated by it. I mean, it's amazing. You can lie there with headphones on and just listen to the sounds. And it is meditative. It actually says quite a lot about mental health and people's need for, you know, outlets and meditation and so on. But I love the fact that those words all mean something, but actually as a collective term, I'm not sure what it means, but it has currency on the people who know. And weird sensation feels good, the wonderful word of ASMR, is enough for the people who don't know about it, curious enough to come and see it. Incidentally, the big installation that you have to book your slot, we're oversubscribed, but we're running it long. First of all, the curators told me that in Sweden people were starting to fall asleep. And the one thing the idea as a museum director that people come to your museum and fall asleep is horrifying. It's abject, it's everything you don't want. But I now realise this is a provocation. I want as many people to come and fall asleep as possible in the museum. And the second thing they told me was you have to take your shoes off to go into the main installation because it's just got big white sort of cosmic cushions and so on. You know. And at the end of the run in Stockholm, there were 7 unclaimed pairs of shoes. Now, when you think that means that people have gone into the exhibition, spent hours or whatever, lost themselves, but they've actually left the museum and gone home and not bothered with the shoes. That speaks volumes for the transformative power of ASMR. That's a design, art meditative crossover. Yeah, anyway, so that's my aim as well, is to get, I'm not competitive, but I am to the extent I want 8 pairs of shoes and a lot of people falling asleep.
I mean, we've got a lot of art historians and people who want to work in the art world in the audience, and so it'd be really great if you could just quickly maybe tell us about your career, how you got into it. What would your advice be for people who want to?
My advice would be, although I am a generalist and I have lots of cultural curiosity, and I have the opportunities now to program things and learn about things I know nothing about, which I would advocate that you all remain as curious as possible. I think some degree of expertise at the beginning of your career is a good thing. So I would advise anyone who wants to develop a career curatorially to think postgraduate. I know that's a big commitment, and I know you're already going to be leaving here with debt. But I do think if you want to become a curator, you need to think about postgraduate work. I think if you want to go into the commercial art world, you need to want to sell, because it's a different world. I mean, I never sold. I worked with artists and so on. But I think that my engagement with artists has often been through the art history that I did, and I can relate in that way. But it's both not just for your CVs, but just trying to get some understanding of art history in some kind of depth gives you, in a kind of paradoxical way, a sense of a bigger picture too. So that would be the first advice. And the second advice is just see a lot of art. I'm amazed at the number of people who have applied for jobs in the different institutions I'm in, who seem really smart, engaged, well qualified, who just haven't seen anything. I mean, obviously, if you're in London, there's loads to see, but there's plenty to see here. You need to go and see the exhibitions that are on, and you certainly in London, there's no excuse for not. Even if your interest is historic, you need to be going. So you have to go and spend a fortune on all the paid-for exhibitions in all the institutions in London. But you need to go and look at the commercial galleries. You need to. The big galleries do major shows with major artists, and you need to go and see things. There's no, art history is actually about engaging with objects or experiences as well as understanding how it makes sense and what those objects tell us about the world in which it was created. But in order to understand that, there's no substitute for actually having an understanding of what's produced in the world now and seeing it all. So you won't believe the advantages that accrue from just getting out there and seeing it. And I'd also ask yourselves, do you actually gain pleasure as well as intellectual stimulation from from looking at those objects. Because I do, and I still do, and I never tire of it, and there's no busman's holiday for me. I mean, I'm not bad on the beach. I'm quite happy to decompress and read books lying by a pool on holiday. But I go nuts if I'm not going to go and visit something at some stage. And that actually, cultural spectacle for me as well. I mean, I'm not trying to justify football as an art form, but I could do if you really want to push me. But I think seeing things and understanding things in a cultural context actually help you and make you better art historians. Yeah, go and look at a lot of things. You've got a fantastic museum here, a couple actually, but particularly Ashmolean. I was late. Cecily was waiting for me. She was very patient. I was starting to get a bit worried. And I have to confess that I thought, my life is so regulated. You have to be here and then here and then here. And I managed to get a train 20 minutes earlier. And that was the fault because I lost my sense of time. And I literally ambled down and went into the Ashmolean. And I just wanted to look at that Uccello again, which I've not seen for 3 years. And then I got lost in looking around at some of the objects there. And I have to say, the pleasure you get of that. So don't neglect what's on your doorstep. And also, don't be... I learned at the National Gallery that you can get overwhelmed. You think, oh, there's too much here. So the other thing is, a lot is better than a lot every now and again. So that's the other thing about big blockbuster exhibitions. You say, I've got my 2-hour slot. God, there's so much to see. You're going to get saturated. But just go and look for 10 minutes at a painting. Choose a particular painting or an artwork or an object and just go and look at it. Go and look at the Gallery of Font, actually. Pretty cool. Bird Bar. Fantastic. It's in the corner, just too long. Yeah, but look.
Well, that's very helpful. But as in when you, at the very start of your career, how did you get your foot in the door?
Yeah.
After
So I read history. Then I was going to read architectural, do an MPhil in architectural history, but realised I wanted to move more into the 20th century. So I did an MA at Coleclough, French art between the wars, but my thesis was on British sculpture in the 60s. And that put me into contact with living artists, and I realised that's something I really enjoyed and responded to, particularly a man called Anthony Cara, and interviewed, got access to for my postgraduate. And that's the other thing as a postgraduate which you can do. I mean, I try and help undergraduates if they say, I'm writing a thesis, can you help me? But I'll definitely help a postgraduate, and artists will as well, I think. Anyway, so then I did my MA and decided I'd do a PhD, and for my sins I've never finished the PhD, although I'm not sitting on it. I stopped my British Academy funding after a year and a half because I started to, I managed to, some of the people I met in the research of my MA and then my PhD, there was a museum director called Brian Robertson, who used to run the Whitechapel. There was a critic and writer, a Ruskinian writer called Tim Hilton, and a man at Tate Gallery, as it was called then, a man called Richard Humphreys, who Tim Hilton said you should go and see him. They're looking for young lecturers at lunchtime. You seem to be able to talk. So they gave me a couple of lunchtime lectures. I got a bit of money for doing that. Tim Hilton commissioned me to write a couple of pieces for The Guardian. But Brian said, who did a lot of broadcasting, said the BBC radio, they're definitely looking for younger people to start doing some reviewing. So I'm giving me your name. So somebody rang me up and nattered to me for a bit, and I didn't realise it was an audition. So then they gave me the opportunity just to review with a presenter a Tony Cragg exhibition at the Lisson Gallery. So we just did a walk around. And actually I never knew what I wanted to do, but I just kept on doing this. That's the other piece of advice is, if you don't know what it is you want to do, just keep doing things. So write. One of the great things about the current digital era is there are platforms for you to write. There are platforms for you to podcast on. There are platforms for you to be able to, you can curate digitally. So I just started to do those things, and then in the end, opportunities came that way. I ended up getting a job for a year programming lectures and symposia at the Tate, and then the radio, BBC Radio Kaleidoscope was the arts programme. They gave me a crack at presenting, and I did a bit of presenting, and then that kind of worked. And then I started. The Tate wanted to launch a magazine, so they encouraged me to apply. magazine while I was broadcasting. So this kind of portfolio career evolved, and then eventually I started working with, I curated a show of sculpture from PhD research at the Guggenheim in Venice, and that's when I came into contact with a man called Jay Joplin, who became a friend of mine, and Jay was running this amazing gallery called White Cube in St James, and he said, look, I think you should come and work with me, and I said, well, I'm actually doing all these other things. He said, no, you can do all those other things, but come and work with me. So then he just set up Hoxton. So we then, I was one of the partners there, and I couldn't, he always thought I should have sold, but I didn't sell artworks, but I was able to help get good artists to work with them, and so that's how it evolved. I hate it when people tell you about their careers, because you say, well, I got a chance to do radio, thinking, how did you get that? But the point is, things are quite fortuitous in my case, but I knew that by doing postgraduate work, it would put me in contact with interesting people, and it kept me working. And then once you get a chance to lecture, you put the work in to deliver the lecture, and then you get more, or you get the chance to do some writing, and then it can lead to more. And that's been the model. But there are other people. I mean, Nick Sirota was telling me not so long ago that he knew from when he was an undergraduate that he wanted to be a museum director, and he wanted to be running the Tate. So he came to university here, Cambridge. Then he got a job as an assistant curator at the Museum of Modern Art in Oxford. Then he was appointed director of Whitechapel. Then he was appointed director of the Tate. Then he expanded the Tate. So some people have so if you know what it is you want to do in 20 years' time, a different model. If you don't, but you know it's involved in the art world, and you want it to be a journey of discovery, and actually you'll discover more of what it is you want to do as you go along, then I suppose mine is not a bad one.
So I have one more quick question before I think maybe our audience would like to ask some things. But we've talked a lot about humans and we've talked a lot about people. So I'd like to ask you about Ada, the first robot artist. You've had an exhibition at the Design Museum. What do you think about Ada? I believe you've had a conversation with this first robot artist. And where do you think that AI, Ada, and this kind of technological development leaves the future of art history and design?
I have had a conversation with Ada. I really like the way you refer to Ada as the robot artist, because I kept referring to Ada as she. And the one question I didn't ask Ada, which I would have done last week at the Abu Dhabi Culture Summit, but that was postponed because so I was going to do a conversation with Abu Dhabi, and I think we're going to do it in October. One of the questions I want to ask Ada is why she identifies as female, when gender is such an interesting and fluid thing. And I don't know whether she'll give me the correct answer, because algorithmically I don't know if she's been programmed to say, well, the people who program me have a particular view of femininity, and this is how I've been programmed. But I found it curious, slightly frightening, and I was conscious of my own response being manipulated. But its art, I mean, it's algorithmically programmed, I think, to produce a certain kind of work that is sort of mid-century modernism. And the self-portraits are sort of a bit of expressionism, and the abstractions are, mid-century modernism. But the art's getting, the programming's getting more sophisticated, the art's okay. And I like the fact that Ada, which is a phenomenally expensive program, is actually funded by its art, itself. And I'm really curious as to how defensive the art world is about the art. And the commercial art world has been really defensive about it. And you're thinking, hang on, you've always believed that the market should be the judge of things. We've always believed in the last 30 years, in post-conceptual art. There isn't anything more emphatically post-conceptual than an AI-programmed robot that's producing art that the market wants to buy. So just deal with it. I mean, it's the kind of post-Duchampian gesture. I don't have to think the art's that good, so but that's fine. But in that market, but as a cultural phenomenon, I find it fascinating. So it's quite clear. I mean, I don't know if you heard the week lectures. It's quite clear that AI is. There's no question that it will become something that, if programmed wrongly, or if allowed to be untravelled, it is threatening. There is no question about it. I mean, it's not me being paranoid. I'll be out of it by the time they take over. But I find it fascinating to look at a direct manifestation of algorithmical programming. And so it's something that I would encourage you all to take note of and have a look at. Actually, you know what? if you want, I can put, Ada's partly programmed through here. You should definitely ask Ada to come and do a session in conversation with you here in Oxford. You should. And let the audience do it. I mean, it's interesting that Ada Mellor, who's the man behind it, he likes it if so I submitted a whole load of questions when I did the talk with Ada. It's not, it's just, you get a better answers if you send the questions ahead. But then you can just follow up and go here, there and everywhere. And sometimes you get a really interesting answer, and sometimes you just sort of blank, you know, so you just like splurge. But it's really boundary blurring, I think. And the Design Museum show was he wanted more of the art, and we put the art as examples of the manifestation of algorithmic programming and robotic design. And we showed the technology and design. That's why I was interested in the Design Museum. Whereas, you know, the Royal Academy, I mean, I think Ada should definitely submit to the summer exhibition, and they would have to get it. But the Academy would have been much more nervous because Ada's not an elected Royal Academician, so it shouldn't be shown in the Royal Academy. But interesting, it's slightly shown because the art world is it's nominally confident about, you know, so we're often defending, you know, the Philistine hordes, inverted commas, of tabloid newspapers and the lunacy and the joking about art's going to be indulgence and so on. And we're fine at defending all of that, or at least explaining why art needs to be taken seriously in certain ways, but why art can be judged. You know, we should be confident about judgment. But it's really the threat that was that is still perceived by Ada. I mean, Ada was slagged off in so many different art journals because of its presence in the Venice Biennale, and you think, really? It was a lot worse in the Venice Biennale than Ada. And a lot better.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. I think we might have, I don't know if we have enough time for
You've all got exams to do, haven't you?
Does anyone have a burning question that they'd like? I don't want to deprive anyone, but if anyone would like to ask anything at the moment, does anyone have any questions? I'm encouraging this, by the way. We do have to get to dinner at some point, and feel free to talk to Tim.
Do you know what? I mean, I'm not, but you probably all need to go. If you want to ask a question, come and ask it. We can just sit on the side of the stage and do it. And then it just means that because you know it's not a full auditorium, so you're all probably feeling morally obliged to sit it out. But you can go and go to dinner. And those who want to ask questions, we can